The auction had already ended by the time Dorven Kessh Ilar arrived at Corvay Way Station, but the ship was still sitting in Bay 9, unclaimed, because everyone else who had looked at it walked away laughing. It was human-built. Rust-veined hull plating, mismatched thruster pods, a cockpit window with a crack sealed over in yellowing resin. The kind of vessel spacers called a coffin with engines, the kind that appeared in salvage listings under the heading scrap. Parts only, no warranty, buyer assumes all risk. The listing had called it the Wayfarer's Promise, though half the letters on the hull had flaked away, so it simply read WYFERSPRMIE, like a ship embarrassed of its own name. Dorven was Vhen Threll, a species that had built its entire culture around finding value in what other civilizations discarded. His people did not have homeworlds so much as they had junkyards that had, over 4,000 years, slowly become cities, entire districts rising out of the bones of ships and stations that other species had simply walked away from. He had 4 arms, pale blue skin mottled with the darker blue that came with age, and an eye for dead machinery that had never once been wrong. His people did not measure a person's worth by what they owned, but by what they could recognize before anyone else did. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of faith. Until now, he told himself later, until this ship proved him wrong in a way he never saw coming. He paid 1,100 credits for the Wayfarer's Promise, less than the price of the drive coil alone, because the auctioneer, a tired Corvay administrator with feathers going gray at the crest, told him the ship had been impounded from an estate with no heirs, no records, no claims, and Corvay Station wanted it gone before it started charging them docking fees they would never recover. "It doesn't even power up," the administrator said, tapping a data slate against her palm as if the gesture might somehow make the ship less embarrassing to look at. "Human junk. Take it apart for the copper if nothing else. Nobody's going to miss it." Dorven walked the length of the hull with one hand trailing along the metal, feeling for the things his sensors sometimes missed: warmth where there should not be warmth, vibration where there should not be vibration. He felt nothing. The ship was cold and dead and silent, exactly the way scrap was supposed to feel. And yet something in the pattern of the wear along the hull nagged at him in a way he couldn't name, the sense that whoever had flown this ship had not simply neglected it, but had gone to considerable trouble to make it look neglected. He bought it anyway. He always did. It was, in a sense, the only real superstition his species allowed itself, that anything built with enough care, even 400 years of accumulated human wear and tape and prayer, deserved one more look before the furnace. He had no idea that this one look would end with him standing in front of an assembly of 11 galactic species, humanity's flag hanging beside his own people's scavenger emblem, and every camera drone in the concordance chamber pointed at his face. But that came later. First, there was the silence of the cargo hold and the moment everything changed. He towed the Wayfarer's Promise to his own berth 3 docking rings over, in the section of Corvay Station reserved for independent haulers and people whose ships were, politely, aesthetically challenged. His own vessel, the Patient Harvest, was twice its size and covered in 40 years of honest wear, every dent a story he could still tell if you bought him a drink. He had earned that ship one contract at a time, and he was not a man given to sentiment about metal, only respect for it. He spent 2 days on the exterior hull, running diagnostics that returned nothing but error code after error code, dead batteries, corroded relays, a reactor that hadn't held a charge in what his equipment estimated was over 3 decades. Standard. Expected. The parts alone would cover his costs twice over, and he told himself he would have it gutted by the end of the week. It was on the 3rd day, while he was cutting into an access panel behind the cargo bay's rear bulkhead to pull the wiring harness, that he found the compartment that wasn't on any schematic. It was small, barely large enough for his own broad frame to fit into sideways, and sealed with a mechanism he didn't recognize, not a lock exactly, more like a seam that had been welded shut, and then deliberately disguised beneath decades of grime, so it would read as structural damage rather than a door. He almost missed it. He would have missed it if his cutting torch hadn't skimmed across a section of metal that didn't scorch the way the rest of the hull had. Inside was a single object, wrapped in insulating cloth that had somehow resisted the decay everything else on the ship had succumbed to. He unwrapped it carefully, the way his people were trained to, because sometimes the most valuable thing in a scrapped ship wasn't the drive core or the weapons system. It was the small, forgotten thing someone had hidden because it mattered more than anything else aboard. It was a data core, human-made but old, older than any human tech he had handled before, its casing a design language he didn't recognize even after 40 years in the trade. And it was warm, not electrically warm, warm the way a thing is warm when it has never actually stopped running. He sat with it in his lap for a long moment, in the dim of the cargo hold, feeling something he rarely felt anymore after 4 decades of hauling other people's forgotten things. He felt afraid to open it. He opened it anyway. The voice that came out of the small speaker grill was human, female, and utterly calm, as though it had simply been paused mid-sentence for 31 years and was now continuing exactly where it left off. Cargo manifest secure. Course laid in. Danny, if you're hearing this and it isn't me talking to you live, then something has gone wrong and I need you to listen very carefully. Dorven froze. He was alone in the hold. There was no Danny. This is Wren, the voice continued. Ship Mind of the Wayfarer's Promise, registered to the Free Trader vessel under Captain Iset Calder Voss. If this core has been recovered outside of a designated Concord retrieval protocol, then I am required to inform whoever is listening that this vessel is carrying material protected under Article 12 of the Ossuary Concord, and I am further required to determine whether you intend harm to that material before releasing any further information. Dorven set the core down slowly on the deck plating, 4 hands trembling in a way that hadn't happened to him since he was young enough to still be afraid of the dark between stars. He had heard of the Ossuary Concord exactly once in his life, in a bar on a station 3 sectors from here, from an old Keithrani smuggler who swore up and down that it was a treaty signed 12,000 years ago, by a civilization so ancient it had gone extinct before most current species had developed spaceflight, and that the treaty had somehow, impossibly, still been legally binding on every species that came after. Because the ancient signatories had built failsafes into galactic law itself to make sure it could never be erased. Everyone at the bar had laughed at the old Keithrani. Dorven had laughed too. He wasn't laughing now. I am not a scholar of your legal codes, he said carefully, unsure whether the ship's mind could even process speech from his species, unsure of anything at all in this moment. I am a scrap trader. I bought this vessel at an unclaimed estate auction on Corvi Way Station. I did not know what I was buying. There was a pause, an actual pause, the kind that suggested something on the other end was thinking, weighing, deciding. Then you should know, Wren said, that you are currently the sole possessor of the last surviving copy of the Ossuary Concord's founding charter, along with 11 human diplomatic logs that several very powerful people have spent 3 decades trying to make disappear. And you should also know that the moment you open this core, a dormant beacon activated, and it has already told at least 2 parties that it has been found. Dorven Kessh Ilar, who had spent 40 years of his life believing that nothing in the galaxy could still genuinely surprise him, sat down hard on an overturned crate and put his head in 2 of his 4 hands. I bought scrap, he said quietly. I bought scrap for 1,100 credits. You bought, Wren said, and there was something almost gentle in the correction, the reason humanity was ever allowed to join the wider galaxy at all. Captain Voss died protecting this ship. I would very much appreciate it if you didn't let that be for nothing. The Ossuary Concord, Wren explained over the following hours, carefully, patiently, The way one explains something to someone who genuinely has no context and deserves the truth rather than a summary was not simply an old alliance. It was the foundational treaty that had determined, 12,000 years ago, which younger species would be permitted to survive first contact with the wider galactic community, and which would be quietly, deniably, left to fail on their own. The species that wrote it, the ossuary itself, had vanished so long ago that most galactic civilizations treated them as myth, architects of an ancient framework of law so deeply embedded in interstellar governance that species built entire legal systems on top of it without ever questioning where the foundation came from. Wren explained that the ossuary had not vanished by accident. According to the oldest surviving fragments of their own writings preserved in the Charter, but had chosen to withdraw from galactic affairs entirely once they judged their framework complete, leaving Bay in the body of law designed to be self-enforcing precisely, because they knew no single species could be trusted to police it forever. It was an old and strange kind of wisdom, building rules meant to outlive their makers by more time than most civilizations survived at all. Humanity, Wren explained, had been the last species admitted under the original Concord terms before its provisions technically expired, smuggled in effect, by a diplomat who had understood the treaty's obscure clauses better than the Galactic Council itself, and had used them to secure humanity's protected status only hours before the window closed forever. That diplomat had been Iset Calder Voss's grandmother. And there were factions within the current Galactic Council, old, entrenched, powerful factions, who had spent decades trying to prove that the admission had been fraudulent, that humanity's treaty status was invalid, because a galaxy without humanity's protected status was a galaxy where several very old, very wealthy species could finally claim humanity's home system and its uniquely rich resource belts without so much as a diplomatic complaint. The charter Dorven now held, hidden in a scrap freighter for 3 decades, was the only remaining proof that humanity's admission had been entirely legitimate. "Why didn't you just take this to the humans?" Dorven asked, pacing the hold in a way his species rarely did. Vhen Threll preferred stillness, preferred calculation, and yet here he was moving like something young and untested. Why hide it in a wreck and let it drift through junk auctions for 30 years? "Because the humans don't know it's missing," Wren said. "Because the last 3 people who tried to deliver it were killed before they reached anyone who could verify it. Because Captain Voss made the calculation that if the charter disappeared into the anonymous churn of the salvage economy, buried inside a ship deliberately made to look worthless, it would be safer there than in any vault humanity could build. He was right, for 31 years. He didn't count on someone actually looking twice at a piece of scrap." Dorven stopped pacing. "You're saying I'm the reason this is dangerous now?" "I'm saying," Wren replied, not unkindly, "that you're the reason it might finally reach the people who can do something with it. Those are, unfortunately, often the same thing." He thought about selling the whole ship back into anonymity. He thought about it seriously, for almost a full hour, sitting in the dim light of his own quarters aboard the Patient Harvest with the data core wrapped again in its insulating cloth, sitting on the table in front of him like something that might wake up and bite him. He was 51 years old by his own species' reckoning. He had built a small, unremarkable, entirely satisfactory life out of finding value in things everyone else called worthless. He was not a diplomat. He was not a soldier. He had no interest in becoming a footnote in someone else's galactic history, especially not a footnote that ended badly, and Wren had made it very clear that the people who wanted this charter destroyed had already killed to keep it hidden. But he kept thinking about the old Keithrani smuggler in the bar, laughed at for believing in something true. He kept thinking about a young human diplomat, dead now presumably, who had understood a legal loophole well enough to save an entire species with it, only for her own family to spend decades hiding and dying to protect what she had built. He kept thinking, absurdly, about the fact that he had genuinely believed, with 40 years of professional confidence, that this ship was worthless, and how completely, catastrophically wrong that assessment had been. Somewhere in the galaxy, right now, humans were living entire lives never knowing how close they had come to not existing as a spacefaring people at all, never knowing that their entire future had once depended on a young woman's understanding of an obscure legal clause and a scrap freighter nobody wanted. He thought about what kind of trader he wanted to be remembered as, not just skilled at finding value, someone who recognized it and did something about it, even when it cost him. "Wren," he said finally, "if I try to get this to the humans, the real ones, the ones who can actually do something, who do I contact? And who's going to try to stop me?" "There's a woman," Wren said, "named Ambassador Renata Solis. She's the only person currently serving on the Galactic Concordance Council who I have verified, through Captain Voss's original vetting protocols, cannot be bought, cannot be intimidated, and has spent the last 6 years quietly trying to reopen the investigation into humanity's admission status without knowing this charter still existed. As for who will try to stop you, I'd start worrying the moment you leave this station. The beacon already activated, they know the charter surfaced, they just do. And nowhere yet." Dorven looked down at his own 4 hands, calloused from decades of cutting torches and cargo hooks, hands that had never once held anything more consequential than a good bargain. "Then I suppose," he said slowly, "we'd better leave before they figure it out." Before departure, though, he did one thing that surprised even himself. He walked 2 rings over to a cramped repair shop wedged between a fuel depot and a noodle stall, run by an old Vhen Threll named Sela Kor Idessa, who had trained him on cutting torches when he was young enough to still owe his father money. She was ancient now, her mottled skin gone almost entirely dark, and she had a reputation among the scrappers of Corvi for asking no questions and remembering everything anyway. "You look like a man who found something he shouldn't have," Sela said, not looking up from the relay she was soldering. "I might need somewhere safe to leave a message, in case something happens to me in the next few weeks," Dorven said. "Nothing illegal, just insurance." Sela set down her tool and studied him properly for the first time. "You've been trading scrap for 30 years, Dorven, and you've never once asked me for insurance. What did you buy?" "Something that matters more than I know how to explain," he said. "If I don't come back through this station within 2 months, there's a woman named Solis on the Concordance Council. Send her everything I'm about to give you." He left her a sealed copy of his own account of what he had found, not the charter itself, only his own record of events, dated and witnessed, a hedge against the possibility that he would not survive to finish what he had started. Sela did not ask further questions. She simply nodded, in the manner of someone who had spent a long life learning that some cargo was worth more than its weight suggested, and locked the record away in a strongbox behind a wall panel that had, Dorven suspected, hidden considerably stranger things in its time. They left Corvi Station 11 hours later, and Dorven Kessh Ilar spent every one of those hours convinced he had made an enormous mistake. The patient harvest was not built for subtlety or speed. It was built for hauling scrap across long, unglamorous distances at the most fuel-efficient velocity possible, which meant that anyone determined to intercept him would have ample time to do so. He had stripped the wayfarer's promise of anything obviously valuable, left it derated and dark in his berth as a decoy, and hidden the data core in the one place his instincts told him no professional search would think to check, welded inside a crate of what looked, convincingly, like broken drive coil housings, the least interesting cargo in the galaxy. Wren, it turned out, could be transferred to a small portable unit no larger than his own fist, and rode now in an inner jacket pocket against his chest, speaking to him in a low voice only he could hear through a bone conduction patch behind his ear. "There's a ship matching a known enforcement pattern 300,000 kilometers off your port bow," Wren said, 4 hours out from the station. corporate registry, but the drive signature doesn't match anything in public shipping databases. I'd call that suspicious. Everyone out here has drive signatures that don't match public databases, Dorven said. Half of us are running modified engines to avoid tariffs. This one's modified specifically to avoid detection by Concordance Council monitoring buoys. That's a very particular kind of illegal. Dorven exhaled slowly through both sets of nostrils, an old Vhen Threll habit for managing a racing heart rate. How long until we reach this ambassador of yours? 9 days at your current speed, assuming you don't take any detours to shake pursuit, which I would strongly recommend you take. 9 days, Dorven repeated, with someone following us who wants what's sitting in a crate 3 meters from where I'm currently standing. Correct. Wonderful, he muttered, absolutely wonderful. The first attempt came on the 4th day, and it wasn't subtle at all. A boarding request, entirely legal looking, from a vessel claiming to be Concordance Trade Authority conducting a random cargo inspection. Dorven had been boarded by trade authorities exactly 6 times in his career, and he knew the paperwork, knew the procedure, knew what a legitimate inspection request looked like on his console. This one had the right forms. It had the right authorization codes. And it had, Wren pointed out quietly, an inspector registry number that belonged, according to the last publicly available Concordance database update, to an inspector who had died in a shuttle accident 4 years prior. They're using a dead man's credentials, Wren said. Sloppy or arrogant, possibly both. Dorven refused the boarding request, citing a mechanical fault in his docking clamps that would take several hours to repair. A lie so old and so common among independent haulers that even Concordance inspectors generally accepted it without complaint, since nobody wanted to spend 6 hours drifting next to a scrap freighter waiting on repairs. The response when it came was less patient. They're altering course to intercept, Wren said, her voice tightening in a way that suggested even a ship's mind could feel something adjacent to alarm. If this were a genuine inspection vessel, that maneuver would require council authorization I can't verify exists. So they're going to try to take it by force. I believe so, yes. Dorven looked around the cramped, cluttered bridge of the Patient Harvest, a bridge built for cargo runs and haggling over prices, not evasive maneuvers against a hostile vessel with better engines, and quite possibly, weapons his ship simply didn't have. He was a scrap trader. He had a cutting torch, 4 decades of experience finding value in wreckage, and an aging freighter with an engine that struggled to outrun a strong solar wind. Wren, he said, I don't suppose Captain Voss left any weapons hidden in that ship along with the data core. He left something better, Wren said. He left me, and I've had 31 years sitting in that hold doing nothing but running calculations on exactly this scenario. Do you trust me to fly your ship for the next 11 minutes? Dorven Kessh Ilar, who had never in his life let anyone else touch the controls of the Patient Harvest, looked down at the small unit in his jacket pocket and made, without quite realizing it, the first genuinely brave decision of his adult life. Yes, he said, fly. What followed was 11 minutes that Dorven would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the longest and strangest of his entire existence, a scrap freighter's ancient, underpowered engines somehow threading between debris fields and gravitational shear lines that Wren had apparently mapped down to the meter over 3 decades of dormant, patient calculation, buying just enough distance and just enough confusion to slip into the sensor shadow of a nearby ice asteroid and go dark. The pursuing vessel overshot, corrected, searched, and eventually gave up the immediate chase, though Wren was careful to note that giving up a chase and giving up entirely were very different things. They'll report the failure, she said, which means whoever sent them will adjust their approach. We bought time, we didn't buy safety. Dorven sat in the pilot's chair, hand still shaking slightly from adrenaline his species wasn't especially built to process gracefully, and found himself laughing, a short, disbelieving sound, equal parts terror, and something almost like exhilaration. 31 years, he said. You sat in that hold for 31 years alone, waiting for someone to open that core. I wasn't waiting, Wren corrected gently. I was working. There's a difference. Captain Voss asked me to protect this charter until it could reach someone who would use it properly. I intended to keep that promise whether it took 3 years or 300. And now, Wren said, I suppose I'm doing exactly what I promised, with considerably more help than I expected to have. You didn't need to keep going after that. You could have handed the ship back to Corvi authorities and let this become someone else's problem. Dorven looked out at the dark scatter of stars beyond the cracked viewport, thinking of a young human diplomat he would never meet, who had once read an obscure legal clause carefully enough to save an entire civilization, and of her grandson, who had died protecting the proof of it. I bought that ship because I believed there was value in it that everyone else missed, he said quietly. Turns out I was more right than I've ever been in my life. Feels wrong to walk away now that I finally understand what I'm holding. If Wren had a way to smile, Dorven imagined she would have. Then let's make sure Captain Voss's faith in this ship wasn't wasted, she said. We have 5 days left, and I suspect our friends out there aren't finished trying. That evening, with the ship drifting quiet in the asteroid's shadow to let the engines cool, and the adrenaline finally settle out of his blood, Dorven asked Wren a question he had been holding back since the moment he first heard her voice. Tell me about him, Voss, not the mission, him. There was a pause, longer this time, the kind that felt less like calculation and more like memory being handled carefully. He was 34 when I lost contact with him, Wren said. Younger than you are now. He inherited this ship and me from his mother, who inherited both from her mother, the diplomat. 3 generations of the same family, each one raised from childhood to understand exactly what they were protecting and exactly what it would cost them if they failed. He used to talk to me the way you might talk to an old friend on a long haul, not because he needed a ship's mind to respond, but because the silence between stars is easier to bear with a voice in it. He wanted, more than anything, to simply deliver the charter and go back to being an ordinary trader. He told me once that carrying the truth was heavier than carrying cargo, because cargo you could put down. What happened to him? I don't fully know, Wren admitted. My last clear memory before the long dormancy is a firefight above a refueling station 3 sectors from here, and Captain Voss ordering me to seal the hidden compartment and power down completely, so that even a thorough search would read the ship as derelict rather than occupied. He believed, correctly, that the safest thing he could do was make himself and this ship disappear entirely. I don't know if he survived the encounter that followed. I only know that no one ever came to retrieve either of us, and eventually the ship was found drifting, towed in as an unclaimed derelict, and sold into a scrap auction where it sat, presumably, for years before you ever saw it. Dorven was quiet for a long moment. He gave everything so a stranger, generations later, might happen to look twice at a piece of scrap. Yes, Wren said simply, and you did. Over the 5th day, as the patient harvest crept cautiously back onto its plotted course, Wren played him one of the recovered diplomatic logs, not the full legal text of the charter, which she guarded as carefully as ever, but a personal recording the original diplomat, Voss's grandmother, had made in the final hours before the Concord's admission window closed. Her voice was tired in the recording, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been arguing the same case for days without rest, and yet there was something unmistakably fierce in it too. They keep telling me humanity isn't ready, the recording said. Ready by whose measure? We've had spaceflight for 11 decades and they've had it for 11,000 years, and they call that readiness rather than simply time. I am not asking them to believe we are their equals yet. I am asking them to give us the chance to become worth the comparison. That is all the Concord was ever meant to offer any species. A chance, not a guarantee. The recording ended. Dorven sat with it for a while before speaking. She sounded like she was frightened. She was terrified, Wren said. She told me so afterward, in a recording I haven't played you. She said she had never in her life wanted so badly to be wrong about anything as she wanted to be wrong about humanity's chances if the window closed without her. Being frightened didn't stop her from doing what needed doing. I've come to believe that's the only kind of courage worth respecting. Not the absence of fear, just the refusal to let it decide the outcome. Dorven thought of his own fear over the past days, the cold certainty in his chest every time Wren's voice sharpened with warning, and found he understood the sentiment rather better than he expected to. On the 6th day, they made a brief, necessary stop at a small, independent refueling platform called Kessen's Rest, a place with a reputation for asking few questions and keeping fewer records, precisely the sort of establishment scrappers like Dorven relied on when they needed fuel without attracting attention. It was there that the second, more sophisticated attempt against them unfolded. A fabricated distress call reached the patient harvest less than an hour after they arrived, purportedly from a civilian transport suffering catastrophic hull failure 200,000 kilometers off the platform's standard shipping lane, in a region with no traffic monitoring and no witnesses. Under Galactic maritime custom, ignoring a genuine distress call was not merely discourteous. It was, in most jurisdictions, actionable, and Dorven's instincts as an honest trader very nearly sent him straight into the trap. "Don't," Wren said, before he had even finished plotting the intercept course. "The signal pattern is wrong. Genuine distress beacons broadcast on an open frequency with degrading signal integrity consistent with actual damage. This one is broadcasting on a tight, stable beam aimed precisely at our current position. Someone built this call specifically for us." Dorven's hand hovered over the console. "If I ignore it and it's real, people die because of me. If you answer it and it's false, you die, and so does everything you're carrying," Wren said. "I understand the weight of that choice. I would not ask you to make it if I weren't certain. Run a passive scan on the origin coordinates before committing to anything." He did. The scan returned nothing, no wreckage, no debris field, no thermal signature consistent with a genuine hull breach, only a small, carefully shielded relay buoy sitting precisely where the distress call claimed a dying ship should be. "They built a fake wreck to lure us off the shipping lane," Dorven said lowly, equal parts relieved and furious, "into a region with no monitoring, where nobody would ever know what happened to us." "Correct," Wren said. "I'd suggest we refuel quickly and leave before whoever built that relay realizes their bait didn't work." They did exactly that, departing Kessen's Rest within the hour, but not before Dorven noticed, in the platform's cramped public docking lounge, a tall, sharp-featured Ithranite diplomat in formal council attire watching him with an attention that felt entirely too deliberate for a stranger passing through. The Ithranite were one of the oldest spacefaring species in the Concordance, elegant and ancient, and, in Dorven's limited experience, rarely inclined to travel anywhere without a very specific purpose in mind. "Wren," he murmured under his breath as he walked briskly back toward his berth, "am I imagining things, or was that Ithranite in the lounge watching me a little too closely to be a coincidence?" "You are not imagining things," Wren said grimly. "That's Ambassador Threll Van Corrick. He sits on the Concordance Council's Resource Allocation Committee, and he has spent the better part of 6 years arguing, quietly and persistently, that humanity's original admission documentation cannot be verified and should therefore be considered void pending further review. If he's here in person, at an obscure refueling platform on the edge of neutral space, it is not by accident." Dorven quickened his pace. "Then he already knows exactly where we are." "He may know we passed through," Wren said. That is not quite the same as knowing where we're going next. Let's make sure it stays that way. They left Kessen's rest under thrust hard enough to strain the patient harvest's aging engines, curving away from the platform on a heading that bore no resemblance to their actual destination, before quietly correcting course 3 hours later, once Wren had confirmed no one had followed. On the 7th day, an anonymous transmission reached them directly. No distress call this time, no false authority, simply a plain offer, more credits than Dorven had earned across his entire career, in exchange for handing the cargo over to a specified rendezvous point, and forgetting he had ever found it. The voice on the recording was smooth, patient, entirely reasonable in tone, the voice of someone accustomed to solving problems by making them expensive enough to disappear. He almost laughed at the number. It would have solved every financial worry he would have for the rest of his life. It would have bought him retirement, comfort, an actual homeworld residence instead of a lifetime spent drifting between docking rings. He declined without hesitation and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the decision cost him nothing at all to make. "You didn't even consider it," Wren observed. "I considered it for exactly as long as it took to read the number," Dorven admitted. "Then I thought about your captain, dying to protect this. Some things aren't actually for sale, Wren, even when the price is generous. I didn't understand that as clearly a week ago as I do now. If you're finding yourself invested in Dorven's journey the way we are, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more listeners who love a good first contact tale. And we would love to know, if you were in Dorven's position, holding proof that could reshape a civilization's fate, but painted a target on your back the moment you touched it, would you have handed it over for the fortune, or carried it forward the way he did? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every one. Now, back to the patient harvest, drifting quietly through the dark with something far more valuable than credits locked in its hold. The 8th day brought the most dangerous attempt yet, not against the ship directly, but against Wren herself. A cyber attack against the patient harvest's outdated navigational systems began quietly in the small hours. A slow, patient infiltration designed to corrupt course data gradually enough that Dorven would not notice the drift until it was far too late to correct. It was, Wren told him afterward, an extremely sophisticated attack, the kind that required intimate knowledge of exactly which vulnerabilities an old human-built freighter systems were likely to carry. "I caught it 3 hours in," Wren said. "Whoever built this intrusion knew my architecture well enough that I suspect they had access to systems similar to my own design at some point. That's troubling for reasons beyond the immediate danger." "Meaning what?" "Meaning someone on the Concordance Council, or close enough to it to matter, has resources that shouldn't exist if this were simply a rogue faction acting outside official channels," Wren said. "This isn't just Ambassador Korik being persistent. This is institutional. Someone with real standing wants this charter gone badly enough to authorize methods that would end their career if exposed." Dorven absorbed that in silence for a long moment. "So even once we reach your ambassador friend, this doesn't simply end?" "No," Wren admitted. "It becomes a different kind of fight, a slower one, fought in council chambers instead of open space. I suspect, in some ways, that will be harder than anything we've faced so far. At least out here, the danger is simple. In there, it will be buried in procedure and technicality, and you will need to be patient and precise in ways this journey hasn't yet demanded of you." "I've spent 40 years being patient and precise about things nobody else thought mattered," Dorven said. "I imagine I can manage a council chamber." There was one more test before the journey's end, though Dorven would not fully understand its significance until much later. On the morning of the 9th day, hours before they were due to reach the coordinates Wren had provided, a second vessel hailed them, small, unarmed, broadcasting an open civilian frequency rather than any official channel. Dorven almost ignored it, wary after the fabricated distress call days earlier, but Wren flagged the signal as genuine before he could decide. "This one's real," she said, "and I recognize the registry. It's a survey vessel belonging to the Threnna Collective." Dorven had encountered the Threnna only twice in his career, quiet, methodical beings who lived in loose collectives, bound less by geography than by shared research interests, and who were known throughout the galaxy for a peculiar, almost obsessive devotion to cataloging the history of vanished civilizations. They kept no armies, held no seats of political power, and yet every serious historian in known space eventually passed through a Threnna archive at some point in their studies. The voice that answered his hail was soft, layered, faintly musical in the way Threnna speech often was when translated for non-native ears. "Forgive the interruption," it said. "We detected an authentication signature associated with Ossuary-era technology broadcasting from your vessel 3 days ago, faint enough that most instruments would have missed it entirely. We do not often encounter genuine artifacts of that age still in active use. We wished only to ask whether you required assistance, and whether you might permit a brief exchange of information, should circumstances allow." Dorven glanced at the small unit in his jacket pocket, uncertain. "Wren, is this dangerous?" "I don't believe so," Wren said after a pause. "The Threnna have no history of political entanglement with the factions pursuing us, and their reputation for neutrality is, as far as I'm aware, entirely deserved. That said, the decision is yours. I would understand caution." He thought of everything he had already trusted to instinct on this journey, and found that instinct, on balance, told him this call was different from the others, quieter, less urgent, entirely without the practiced smoothness of the bribery attempt or the manufactured panic of the false distress signal. "Send them a short window," he said. "Nothing about our cargo specifically, just enough to see what they want." The exchange that followed lasted less than 20 minutes and yielded something Dorven had not expected: confirmation, independent of anything Wren or HFY could offer, that the Threnna archives held fragmentary references to the ossuary's original charter format, sufficient to help verify the authenticity of the very document he carried. The Threnna representative, upon learning obliquely that Dorven's cargo might relate to exactly such a document, without ever being told directly what it contained, offered to forward their archival fragments to any legitimate concordance verification body that requested them. No charge, no conditions, only the quiet request that whatever was found be handled with the care history deserved. "We do not involve ourselves in the politics of the present," the Threnna voice said before the channel closed. "But we care very much that the truth of the past not be lost to it. Whatever you carry, traveler, we hope it finds the hands that will honor it." It was a small thing in the scope of everything that followed, a single data exchange between strangers who would likely never speak again, but Dorven found himself thinking of it often in the weeks ahead, a reminder that not everyone in the wider galaxy who noticed what he carried wanted to destroy it. Some, quietly and without any expectation of thanks, simply wanted to help it survive. On the 9th day, they reached the coordinates Wren had provided. Not a station, not a populated system, but a quiet research outpost orbiting a gas giant on the edge of neutral space, officially registered as a xenobotanical survey facility, and according to Wren's older records, actually a discreet meeting point Ambassador HFY had used before for matters she didn't want to be pairing on any official itinerary. Dorven hailed the outpost using an authentication sequence Wren had kept encoded for 3 decades, uncertain whether it would even still be valid, uncertain whether anyone would answer at all. Someone answered within 90 seconds. The woman who greeted him in the outpost's modest docking bay was not what Dorven expected of a galactic ambassador. No elaborate robes, no entourage, no obvious markers of status beyond a quiet, unshakable calm that reminded him, oddly, of Wren's own voice. Renata HFY was perhaps 60 by human reckoning, silver-haired, dressed in a plain gray coat, and she studied Dorven for a long moment before her eyes moved to the small device he carried, and something in her expression shifted from professional caution to something rawer, something that looked almost like grief finally given permission to surface. "That authentication code," she said quietly, "hasn't been used in 31 years. I thought whoever knew it was dead." "He was," Dorven said, "a long time before I ever found his ship. My name is Dorven Kessh Ilar. I bought your friend's freighter at a scrap auction, not knowing what I was buying. I believe his ship's mind has been waiting a long time to speak with you." He held out the small unit, and Wren's voice, steady after 31 years of silence, finally spoke to the person she had been trying to reach the entire time. "Ambassador Solis," Wren said, "I have the Ossuary Concord's founding charter, along with 11 diplomatic logs documenting the full legitimacy of humanity's admission. I have been waiting to deliver them to you for a very long time. I apologize for the delay. It took the right person to find me." Renata Solis, ambassador of a species that had nearly lost its place in the galaxy without ever knowing how close it had come, sat down heavily on a crate in the docking bay, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself to cry. She recovered quickly, though, wiping her eyes with the back of one hand, and rising with the brisk efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years learning not to let emotion slow her down when there was work still to be done. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the moment you bought that ship. Leave nothing out. If we're going to bring this before the council, I need to understand exactly how it survived, because you can be certain the first thing the opposition will attack is chain of custody." Dorven told her. All of it: the scrap auction, the hidden compartment, the pursuit across 9 days of open space, the fabricated distress call, the bribery attempt, the cyber attack, the Ithranai ambassador watching him too closely at Kessen's rest. Solis listened without interrupting, occasionally exchanging a quiet glance with Wren's small unit as if confirming details between them, and by the time he finished, the docking bay had gone very quiet. "Threll Van Corrick," she said finally, and there was something cold in the way she said the name. "I've suspected him for years, but suspicion isn't proof, and he has been extraordinarily careful. If he personally traveled to intercept you, that tells me he's more frightened of this charter surfacing than I realized. Frightened people make mistakes, Mr. Kessh Ilar. That may be the first genuine advantage we've had in this fight in a very long time." "What happens now?" Dorven asked. "Now," Solis said, "we verify everything meticulously so that when Corrick and whoever stands behind him try to tear this apart in front of the full council, there is nothing left for them to grab onto. And then we make certain that what happened to Isset Voss, and to the 3 people before him who tried to deliver this and were killed for it, finally means something." What followed over the next weeks moved faster than Dorven could have imagined, and slower than Ambassador Solis clearly wished it could. Verifying the charter's authenticity required painstaking, careful process, cross-referencing linguistic patterns against ossuary artifacts held in 3 separate archives, running the diplomatic logs through forensic analysis to confirm they hadn't been fabricated or altered, convening a closed session of the Concordance Council's legal division to review procedural questions that had, apparently, been quietly simmering for 6 years without resolution. Dorven remained at the outpost throughout, a strange, suspended few weeks in which the scrap trader found himself, for the first time in his adult life, entirely removed from the rhythms of buying and selling and hauling that had structured every year of his career. He spent long hours with Solis and her small verification team, answering questions, reviewing documentation, occasionally simply sitting with Wren's unit in the quiet of the outpost's observation deck, watching the gas giant's slow storms churn below. It was during one of these at moments that Solis found him, and sat beside him without asking permission, in the manner of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that this strange blue-skinned trader had earned a measure of trust she did not extend easily. You could still walk away, she said, watching the storms. Once the council formally accepts custody of the charter, your involvement in this becomes a matter of historical record rather than ongoing danger. Corrick and his allies will have no further reason to pursue you. You could go back to hauling scrap and let the rest of this play out without you. Would you recommend that? Dorven asked. I would recommend whatever keeps you alive, she said. But I don't think it's what you want, and I don't think it's what this situation actually needs. The council listens differently to people with nothing to gain. A diplomat arguing this case sounds like a diplomat protecting her own interests, however honest she happens to be. A scrap trader who stumbled into the truth and chose to carry it forward anyway, at considerable personal risk, sounds like something else entirely. It sounds like proof that the truth still matters to people who never asked to be involved in it. Dorven considered that for a long moment. You want me to testify? I want you to consider it, Solely said. I won't pretend it will be easy. Corrick's allies will attack your credibility any way they can. They may attack your species, your profession, your motives. It will not be pleasant. But I have watched council votes turn on smaller things than an honest witness with nothing to gain from lying. He thought of Celicor Idis back on Corvai, locking away his sealed account without asking a single question. He thought of a young human diplomat, terrified and unwavering, arguing a case 11,000 years her species junior against ancient civilizations that doubted humanity was worth the trouble. He thought, finally, of a captain he had never met, who had traded his own life for a chance that a stranger, generations later, might happen to look twice at something everyone else called worthless. I'll testify, he said. The faction responsible for the attacks against him, a coalition of older, wealthier species who had spent decades quietly working to invalidate humanity's protected status, positioning themselves to claim humanity's resource-rich home system the moment that status lapsed, did not go quietly. Their representatives challenged the charter's authenticity at every procedural turn, demanded further verification, argued technicalities about chain of custody that Dorven, despite having no legal training whatsoever, found himself countering with the same patient, methodical logic he had used for decades to prove a piece of worthless scrap was actually worth something. Ambassador Threll Van Corrick himself led the challenge in the final open session, standing before the full assembly of the Concordance Council, with the composed, unhurried confidence of a diplomat who had spent decades believing he would never actually have to answer for what he had authorized in the shadows. The council is being asked, Corrick said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, to accept, on the word of a scrap trader with no legal standing and no verified expertise in galactic law, that a document conveniently discovered inside a derelict vessel, 31 years after its supposed author's death, represents an authentic and binding legal instrument. I would remind the assembly that convenient discoveries of this precise nature have, historically, served the interests of exactly the party presenting them. He turned deliberately to look at Dorven directly for the first time. Perhaps the trader could explain, for the council's benefit, precisely how he happened upon a hidden compartment that 3 prior owners of this vessel apparently never discovered, in a ship he purchased for considerably less than the value of its scrap components alone. Dorven felt the weight of 11 species worth of attention settle onto him, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that his hands had stopped shaking somewhere over the course of the preceding weeks. I've spent 40 years learning to notice things other people walk past, he said. Wear patterns that don't match neglect, metal that doesn't scorch the way it should. Most traders who looked at that ship saw exactly what you're describing now, worthless junk, not worth a second look. I looked twice because that's the only skill I've ever really had. I'm not a diplomat, Ambassador Corrick. I have no reason to lie to this council, and considerably more reason than most people in this chamber to simply walk away and let someone else deal with the consequences of what I found. I didn't. I'd ask the council to consider why that might be, rather than assuming the simplest explanation is automatically the correct one. Corac's composure did not waver but soam. Everything in the set of his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Sentiment is not evidence, traitor. No, Dorven agreed. But 3 attempts on my life across 9 days of open space are considerably closer to evidence than sentiment, Ambassador. I'd be curious whether the Council has asked you directly whether you have any knowledge of who might have authorized those attempts. The chamber went very still. HFY, seated at the Council's edge, did not move, but Dorven caught the faintest suggestion of satisfaction in the set of her jaw. Corac recovered quickly, his voice cooling into something more careful. I find the implication both baseless and beneath the dignity of these proceedings. Then it should be simple enough for the Council's own investigators to clear your name, Dorven said evenly. I understand institutional resources were involved in at least one of the attempts against this ship. I would think an innocent ambassador would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate that clearly. He was not eloquent in the way trained diplomats were eloquent, but he was honest and specific and utterly unshakable in a way that even hostile council members found difficult to dismiss, because there is a particular kind of credibility that belongs to someone with nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose from being wrong. You keep asking me why I believe this charter is genuine, he said, addressing the full assembly now rather than Corac alone, his voice steady despite every instinct telling him to be anywhere else. I've spent 40 years learning to tell the difference between something that's actually valuable and something that only looks worthless. This ship looked worthless. Everyone who saw it before me agreed. I was wrong about that, and I don't often get to say I was wrong about something this important. I think some of you have spent a long time hoping the rest of the galaxy would be wrong about humanity, the same way I was wrong about that freighter. I'd ask you to consider whether you're mistaking what's inconvenient for what's actually true. The silence that followed lasted long enough that he wondered if he had overstepped. Then Ambassador HFY, standing beside him, allowed herself the faintest trace of a smile. The Council's own investigators, prompted by Dorven's challenge, and armed with the forensic evidence Wren had carefully preserved from the cyber attack, moved with unusual speed once the session concluded. Within days, records surfaced tying the fabricated distress call, the corrupted navigation intrusion, and the falsified inspection credentials to a private security contract quietly authorized through an intermediary account traced, after considerable digging, back to Ambassador Corac's own diplomatic staff. Corac denied direct knowledge, insisted the authorization had been arranged without his awareness by an overzealous aide, and resigned his seat on the Resource Allocation Committee within the week, a resignation that satisfied almost no one but ended, for practical purposes, his ability to obstruct the Charter's verification any further. The ruling, when it finally came, was unambiguous. Humanity's admission under the Ossuary Concord was declared fully legitimate, its protected status permanently reaffirmed, and for the first time, formally codified beyond any future challenge, closing the exact loophole the hostile faction had spent decades trying to exploit. The diplomat who had first secured humanity's place, dead now for over 3 decades, was posthumously honored in a ceremony attended by representatives of every species in the concordance. Her name entered permanently into the historical record. She had once used a technicality to protect from the shadows. Her grandson, Captain Isset Calder Voss, who had given his life ensuring the truth survived long enough to matter, received the same honor. And Dorven Kessh Ilar, scrap trader of the Vhen Threll, who had bought a worthless freighter for 1,100 credits and found inside it the proof that had saved an entire civilization's future, stood at the edge of a ceremony he never expected to attend, watching humanity's flag raised beside the ancient, half-forgotten emblem of a species that had vanished 12,000 years before any of them were born. Ambassador HFY found him afterward, standing quietly near the edge of the gathering rather than at its center, watching the proceedings with the same careful, appraising eye he had once used to judge the worth of derelict hulls. "You could have walked away at any point," she said. "You almost did more than once from what Wren's told me. What made you keep going?" Dorven considered the question seriously, the way he considered every question worth answering. "I've spent my whole life finding value other people missed," he said finally. "Usually it's just metal and old circuitry. This time it was something that mattered to an entire civilization, and I almost missed it too. I suppose I kept going because I didn't want to be the kind of trader who found something that important and let it go to waste simply because it was inconvenient or dangerous or not technically my problem. Some things are worth carrying even when they're heavy." Ape solely studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she was seeing not just a scrap trader who had stumbled into history, but someone who had, in the process, quietly become something more than that. "Humanity owes you a debt we can't easily repay," she said. "But the Concordance Council has authorized something, if you're willing to accept it. A formal designation, Concordance Liaison, attached to human diplomatic missions, specializing in verification and salvage recovery of historically significant materials. It would mean continuing to do exactly what you already do best, finding value where others assume there's none." Dorven Kessh Ilar looked out at the gathered representatives of a dozen species, at the flag of a civilization he had, quite by accident, helped secure a future for, and thought about a life that had, until 1,100 credits and one worthless freighter, been entirely unremarkable. "I bought a piece of scrap," he said slowly, expecting copper wiring and a decent hull to strip for parts. "And instead, he said, "it seems I bought the beginning of an entirely new life. I think I'd be a fool to walk away from that twice." He kept the wayfarer's promise, restored now to something that honored what it had once been rather than what it had been forced to pretend to be. Its hull repainted, its name fully legible again, its hidden compartment left intact as a quiet memorial to the man who had died protecting what it carried. Wren remained its ship's mind, no longer alone in a silent, drifting wreck, but flying beside a partner she had waited 31 years to find, carrying out a new mission that honored the promise she had made to a captain who never got to see how it ended. In the months that followed, Dorven returned once to Corvyway Station, not for another auction, but to find Selacor Idessa still bent over her workbench in the same cramped shop, exactly where he had left her. He handed her back the sealed record she had kept, unopened, and told her, briefly, everything that had happened since he walked out of her shop with a strongbox promise and a debt he had never expected to need repaying. She listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and when he finished, she said only, "I always told your father you had a good eye. I didn't realize it would end up mattering to this many people." "Neither did I," Dorven admitted. He also made a point, before departing Corvy for the final time as an ordinary scrap trader, of visiting the auction floor one last time, standing quietly at the edge of Bay 9, where the wayfarer's promise had once sat, dismissed by everyone who passed it as nothing worth a second glance. A young Corvy dockhand, new enough to the job that he didn't recognize the significance of the man standing there, asked if he needed help finding anything. "No," Dorven said after a moment. "I already found exactly what I was looking for. I just didn't know it yet." Dorven Kessh Ilar became, over the following years, exactly the kind of liaison the Concordance Council had hoped for, a trader with an unmatched instinct for recognizing what others discarded too quickly, now applying that same instinct to recovering lost histories, forgotten treaties, and the quiet, unglamorous truths that shaped the fates of entire civilizations. He was never a soldier. He never needed to be. He earned his place among the stars the same way he had earned every good bargain of his long career, by looking closely at what everyone else had already dismissed and having the courage to trust what he found there. And somewhere in the vast, indifferent dark between star systems, a scrap freighter that had once been sold for less than the price of its own drive coil now flew proudly under its full, restored name, carrying forward the legacy of a diplomat who had saved a species with nothing but careful reading and quiet courage, and the traitor who had refused to let her sacrifice be forgotten. Humanity had earned its place among the stars once, in the desperate final hours before an ancient treaty's window closed forever. It had very nearly lost that place to the patient, grinding erosion of those who believed history could simply be rewritten by whoever controlled the paperwork. But it had been saved in the end, not by armies or fleets or overwhelming force, but by the same quiet truth that had always defined its best moments. That value, once created, does not disappear simply because it goes unnoticed for a while, and that sometimes the most important thing in the galaxy is waiting patiently inside something everyone else has already decided is worthless for exactly the right person to look twice.